In this episode of IT SPARC Cast, John says something nice about Microsoft, Apple says that AI is dumb, and the CVE of the week crashes right into your firewall. Welcome to IT SPARC Cast. I'm your host, John Barker.
And I'm your host, Lou Schmidt. Let's go see what's going on out there.
The IT SPARC Cast is a digest of the IT news over the last week with insights, opinions, with two people with over 20 years of experience working with IT or with IT vendors. And now, the news bites.
So, via InfoWorld for this week, an excellent question that we should all be thinking about. How do we fund open source? So a recent study showed that 90% of enterprises rely upon open source and the other 10% lie about it. No, wait, that's not exactly what's happening, although it might be. The point is, if you're using Python, if you're using Linux, if you're using any of these open source projects, your business relies on this. But the question is, how do you support that? So we've seen a few things. For example, there was in Python as a great example. There was a left pad accident in 2016. A library caused widespread issues because an NPM package used for padding strings, and it was unpublished from the NPM registry. It dropped out and things started to break all over the place. Request security vulnerability in 2018, the request library. If I remember with that one, it was found to have a security vulnerability that allowed attackers to intercept and modify traffic. And there was like one person maintaining that library. And when they reached that person, they're like, hey, I never meant this thing to be a core piece of the infrastructure. What's going on here? So we are vulnerable to this. I happened to be on the security tiger team of the company I was at the time for this. And I brought this up on the call and said, hey, what are we doing to make sure that this one person maintaining this module has enough income that we're a priority to them? And the answer was, well, we don't have funding for that. What I'd like you to think about is maybe you need to make funding for that. So let's talk about a couple of ways you can do this, because your business requires this software to function. If something breaks, do you have the expertise to fix it quickly? Well, let's look at it. You can do direct monetization. You can get on, say, hey, your project is a core piece of my infrastructure. Here's some money, right? Let's keep you in the game on this one. There's corporate support. So you can sponsor on GitHub. You can sponsor on Patreon. And then there's the Open Collective as well. Code contributions, direct code contributions. I'm one of those sick and twisted people who actually reads through the Linux kernel mailing list. And it's always really interesting to see how many top contributions come from, Google, IBM, Red Hat. Canonical is obviously big in there. Microsoft might surprise you. Quite a lot of kernel changes coming in from Microsoft. They do a pretty good job of supporting open source. I've been really impressed with them. So you can contribute by giving code back into the project. The more alive a project is, the more people will want to support it. Intermediary companies like Red Hat IBM, Canonical, folks like that package this stuff together also fund these projects. Open Source Foundation. There's an open source foundation you can give to. And now this is a new one that I didn't know about. And that was, there are some countries that are actually doing public aid because a lot of these projects are for the public good. You think of it like an infrastructure like you would think of as a road, but when you build that road, you build it everywhere. Germany is leading in this case with the German Sovereign Tech Fund. So we rely on this stuff. How do we keep it going?
Really great points, Lou. And I've had my experience with open source, running software development teams. We've built platforms that run on Linux and make use of various open source pieces. And we know that Linux and open source is really infiltrated the IT space, the data center, and just tools in general. And you're right that somebody has to be thinking about the funding around this and the prioritization of some of these issues. Like, we were talking earlier, if you look at the whole Windows CrowdStrike issue from earlier this year, you have two good sized companies, one, medium sized, one incredibly large, one of the biggest companies on the planet, that are highly motivated to get this issue fixed because their stock price might depend on it. And when you have a company that's worth $1 trillion, they're not going to sit on a massive failure like this. Now, in open source, the developers are motivated, but their motivations and their timelines might be different than yours. So it's really important that that there's a stake in the game when it comes to addressing especially those critical issues, but even also to make sure that the features you're looking for get prioritized at the right way.
Look at your infrastructure, look at the critical stuff that you're using, start thinking about this. Now, another question we have, look at the future of AI. What is it being built on? Most of it's being built on Python, which is open source. Most of it is open source. John, how are we going to power this?
It's a great question. So according to GeekWire, Amazon and the DOE are working together. DOE is the U.S. Department of Energy, by the way, are working on a fund for next generation nuclear reactors, small modular reactors that Amazon's going to be using to power some of their data centers. Now, we talked a few episodes ago about we talked about Microsoft using nuclear power from the 3 Mile Island. We talked about other data centers being powered by small modular reactors. And what we're finding now is that during a recent event, the U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm also shared news of a $900 million grant funding from the U.S. Department of Energy for the deployment of small modular reactors, or SMRs. So this is another sign of, we have clean energy. We have energy that is required as these data centers get bigger, as AI starts to roll out. Sam Altman and others have highlighted the need for much more energy than is currently available. If we deployed AI today the way we expect it'll be deployed over the coming years, there's just no energy allowed for it. So this is a great way to increase the scale of those data centers without causing a hit on the power grid.
This is going to have a really interesting follow-on effect. I've been following nuclear science for many years. What's interesting about this particular reactor technology they're using is they're using an encapsulated, what's called a grain of these refined uranium at fairly low assay, but they're using fluorine salts to cool it. What's new about this? We prototyped that technology in the United States back in the 50s, right? A lot of this stuff has already been done and was deemed not quite ready yet, but now we're ready. We have the materials research, the better way to simulate what's happening in these things. What's cool about using liquid fluorine salts for this is, one, it's at near atmospheric pressure, so you don't have a huge pressure vessel that can blow up. Two, you can build these things to be intrinsically safe. So in the event of some sort of failure, it just sits there, cools itself. In some cases, it's got a plug that'll come out on the bottom. But the third and most intriguing thing to me is there's another design that we've been monkeying around with for a while called a liquid fluorine reactor for thorium. So what most folks may not know is we're not being limited in the nuclear space by the cost of uranium. The United States, Russia, Africa, we have large reserves of uranium. But what you may not know is that the United States, for every ton of uranium we mine, we get 1,000 tons of thorium. And thorium liquid reactors with uranium can breed their own fuel. India is very keen on this as well because while they have meager uranium sources, they have massive sources of thorium. And so while we're talking about doing this in a data center right now, this will have follow-on applications everywhere.
Absolutely. So Lou, we talked about AI quite a bit, but I think that what we're starting to see is maybe some new skills are needed. What do you think about that?
Well, definitely. And this week, Computer World had a really good article on this. They're talking about what they're seeing in the skills shift. First of all, the good news. This month, we've seen a 37% increase, or I should say a 37% decrease in unemployment in the IT sector. What's happening? Well, we've been seeing the news on the large companies that have been laying off, like Cisco and Microsoft and Google. But what we haven't been seeing as much of is the smaller companies. The mid-sized companies are jumping into the breach and snapping people up. Now, one of the big drivers of this is AI. But as we have discussed this, we see AI as entering into it's amazing and cool. But now that the wow factor has sort of like, okay, we're all going wow. Now we're wondering, how will we use this? What is going to happen? So some of the IT folks, the big pickups that we've seen are in like help desk type stuff. Tech support has been a big winner. Other things, we're still looking for developers. You're going to be an AI developer. You're going to be doing Python and a number of other things, but but they're still seeing. If you've read the Jeffrey Moore books, Crossing the Chasm, you know that all the technologies go through the hype phase, then they go through the dip of disillusionment, and then they come back up and they get really, really useful. What we think happened is there was a lot of very advanced, oh my gosh, we're going to replace your position with AI type stuff that happened. And then now everybody's going, wait a minute, because the economy has gotten better. So John, what?
Yeah, so there's a term that I picked up on, early in the hype cycle for AI. From in 2023, economist Richard Baldwin made a claim that AI is not going to take your job, but somebody using AI will take your job. So that is something I've kind of latched onto, and we're going to do some segments on that on our secondary podcast, where we talk about how AI can be used. It's going to be an enhancement to your job. And we actually have an article later that we're going to talk about as well, where that comes into play. And it's really important to be thinking about it that way. And it's not something to be afraid of. It is something to use. It's a tool. Now, the thing is, like any tool, if it's not used correctly, then you get poor results. And so that education and educating yourself on how to use AI appropriately, and how to train your team and how to train your company on AI. A lot of that should fall on the IT team. So that's something that we all need to be thinking about, of the proper use of AI, and not just like data security proper use, although that's an important piece, but also prompt engineering and other ways to use it to make your job more efficient.
You know something? Everything old is new again. But what has been with us the entire time?
That's right. So I read an article in GeekWire that talked about the fact that in this year, 2024, Microsoft turns 50 years old. And it really hadn't occurred to me until I saw that article about, Microsoft being the elder statesman of the software industry and of the innovation cycle. And here on IT SPARC Cast, we do bash on Microsoft quite a bit. They're the big player out there. When vulnerabilities hit, it's big news and impacts lots and lots of people. But to be fair, Microsoft has given a lot to the world of not just IT, but the world in general. So let's face it. Windows became the default desktop interface for the majority of computers out there. It is by far the most common desktop that you're going to find out there. Microsoft Office is the standard for your productivity tools, and that's across the full suite. However you feel about Windows or Microsoft Office, you got to give them credit for that. Their innovations with Xbox and Game Pass. It's something I use. I have a subscription to Game Pass, which gives me, I think that's the future of gaming. It's cloud gaming. It's a subscription base where I don't actually have to buy games. I just have access to them, and you can use them on my Xbox. I can use them on my iPad while I'm remote. It's a great service. And then let's not forget their development tools. .NET and Visual Studio have been leaders in that market for the longest time. So I really do feel like Microsoft deserves a little bit of praise on its birthday. It's a big one that Lou and I both hit a few years ago, but um, but Microsoft deserves some credit here in that they have made a massive impact in all of our lives. Even me as an Apple user, I still use Microsoft Office on a regular basis. I use an Xbox. I do have some Windows systems that I maintain. So it's a huge impact on the world.
And I coming from this, I do this work on an Apple, but I'm mostly a Linux guy. And even I can see the kernel contributions. Did you know, for example, that there's actually a Microsoft distribution of Linux? If you go into Azure, they have a machine built that's their version of Linux. They have done, I think, a really phenomenal job after they got their signals crossed a little when open source first came out. They've done a phenomenal job of supporting the open source community. So for that, thank you.
Yeah, and
Thank you,
I think the
Microsoft.
leadership changes that we've seen there probably helped a lot with that. So as Microsoft has really decided that they're going to be a cloud first company, then some of the older thinking of proprietary, strict controls has really loosened up a little bit.
So when we think about that, let's hop back to Apple.
Let's
Right? We've been talking a lot about AI. Thank you, Microsoft, but Apple had a really really interesting. I don't know for us if it's as much of an epiphany. I think. Why don't you read us in on that?
Sure. So according to Apple Insider, there's a new paper out from Apple's artificial intelligence scientists and their findings are that these large language models, so the AI that we've been talking about over and over again from companies like Meta and OpenAI, lack basic reasoning skills. Now, when I first read that, I was like, okay, yeah, that's fair because that's not what an LLM is. But they made some interesting takes after that. So one reading directly, it says, even adding a single sentence that appears to offer relevant information to a given math question can reduce the accuracy of a final answer by up to 65%. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier about teaching yourself prompt engineering and such, and not misleading the large language model with your prompt. The study concluded that there's just no way you can build reliable agents on this foundation where changing a word or two in irrelevant ways or adding a few bits of irrelevant info can give you a different answer. They said that we found no evidence of formal reasoning in these large language models. So
what do they suggest?
So they suggest a new benchmark. It's called GSM Symbolic. That's going to allow them to measure the reasoning capabilities of various LLMs. So with this, then they can start guiding a standard around how much reasoning and how much certainty you can have in the answers you're getting back from these large language models. And we know that that's been a concern all along. So again, I don't feel that the epiphany of that these large language models aren't reasoning is new. It's not news to me. I don't think it's news to most of you, but the fragility of these systems is something that we have to take into account. And if we can put a benchmark in place to measure the accuracy and or the fragility of these systems, I think that's big and could be very helpful going forward as we start seeing these get used more and more.
Let's face it, in modern software development, it's been my experience watching this. You get what you measure for.
100%. Measurements, KPIs, taking into account the accuracy of these things is all critical. But speaking of taking into account, Lou, what do we got on QR codes?
Well, we talk a lot about potential issues with people breaching your system, and everybody sort of looks and goes, for example, when we were talking about the issue with cups, it's like, well, my users are smart enough, or I'm smart enough not to do that. But what I think a lot of folks have forgotten about is the rise of the QR code. And we'll put in the show notes. I picked this up on X, is of somebody peeling a sticker off of a public guide sign for a park. So it's called quishing. Now think about all of the restaurants you go to that have QR codes to get to the menu, or a QR code to help you, scan this QR code to learn more. Do those restaurants, or does that learn more actually go back and periodically check to make sure those QR codes are going where we think they're going? We saw a breach that would do an instant reload once you went to a certain place, which meant I could click that QR code, bring up the menu, and still breach your computer.
Yeah, so there's a lot to this. So in my mind, QR codes and QR code hacking is the new, drop a USB stick in the parking lot and have somebody then pick it up and insert a virus into your system or a Trojan into your system. So there's a lot of different pieces here. It could even be that the QR code originally was not malicious, but we saw recently one of the URL shortening tools. Basically, the company went out of business because at the end of the day, there's not a lot of money to be made in URL shortening. But a YouTuber that I follow found that a bunch of his old links that he was sending to Amazon and to other places were now going to malicious sites because the URL shortener that he was using went out of business. It got bought by a malicious actor who changed all the links to now point to malicious sites. So it could be that the QR code was totally legit at one point. It could be that somebody put a QR code sticker over your existing QR code and broke that. So I have used QR codes in the past, but I've always done it in a closed system where I was providing training for the salespeople in the company that I worked for. So they saw me in the QR code and they could feel pretty good that that QR code was going to lead to our internal LRM or our internal database for content.
Can we be malicious here? Can we put up some QR codes?
No, we're not going to do that. And so my policy for this YouTube channel is to never put up a QR code to send you somewhere. Go to the show notes. That's where you're going to find the links from us. And the reason is that you don't know who I am. And so you should not be trusting my QR codes. I don't trust your QR codes. So you shouldn't trust mine. And so we'll never be putting up a QR code here. I will never be scanning a QR code that I find on YouTube and expect that to do something good for me.
Are you actually feeling more secure now?
I think, what this points to is what we've talked about in past episodes of one of the biggest defenses that our IT teams have against these bad actors is education of the entire workforce. So again, just like we talked about sending fake phishing emails out and testing to see who's clicking on them, put QR codes up around your enterprise or put them in other documentation. See who's just snapping at them and finding out where they go to. I think you'll be really surprised, and you'll find out that you got people that are snapping these QR codes just because they want to know what it is. And that should be a teaching moment. We should really be taking that into account.
Absolutely. Hey, do you think, Cisco put up a QR code that went wrong?
Maybe.
Well, let me tell you about what happened then. So just a real quick hit. We still don't have a huge amount of detail on this right now, but we know that there was a Cisco internal data breach recently. Part of what they got were records. They got source code. They got product. Rumor has it the hackers are frantically trying to stuff DNA back into Cisco, but Cisco won't take it. But levity aside, they also got some partner and customer information out as well. So probably want to reach out to your local team if you use Cisco and make sure that none of your information was compromised.
Yeah. We just keep seeing these things happen over and over again from all kinds of different companies. It's just, really sad. But with that, we're talking about security. Let's get into the CVE of the week.
Oh my. So a lot of us depend on our firewalls. And why I mean depend on it, we're like, it stops at the firewall, everything's fine on the other side of it. So what we have this week is something, it's October and scary times are happening, and this stuff is truly scary. So there were issues with Fortinet Palo Alto, I believe there's some stuff that happened with Checkpoint. Let's focus on the big ones. The big one is right now, there's a CVE, which is CVE 2024-23113. There will be a test on that later. But no, this one is a 9.8 on the OCRAPometer. Basically an external format string into FortiOS, and it covers a wide range of Fortinet OS. Could potentially allow the attacker to execute arbitrary commands. Ugh. Okay, that's pretty darn scary. So we wander over to Palo Alto, for example, and they use a thing called Expedition. And there are 5 breaches against that. CVEs up to 9.9 on the I need to change my pants scale. I'm not going to go into how many of these things or how bad. I can just say that the one in Palo Alto is an operating system level command injection vulnerability. There's 2 of those, right? A 9.9 and a 9.3 on the ODAMA meter. Okay. Let me give you a really tight takeaway from this. If you're depending on a single thing, last week we talked about a breach that allowed somebody, the Linux breach that we had, that of course spoofs your internal tools. It's a rootkit, right? The host itself will not know it's infected. Now we're seeing a situation where the firewalls themselves are being compromised. You need defense in depth. That means you really need to be thinking about real-time tracking on your network and looking for suspicious traffic, ports that you don't remember opening, stuff like that.
Yeah, this is a big one. And again, it's because it's your firewall vendor, it's the systems and the folks you're expecting to protect you, and that's your attack vector. That makes it extra scary. So you definitely need to be in contact with your account reps from whichever your firewall vendor is, and make sure that you're updated toot sweet, because this is just an open door. Now, the good news is, as of this recording, there is no known public vulnerability, but the method is public. So the information is out there. So it's just a matter of hours or days before the exploits are in the wild. So get to patching right away.
Now, in theory, this is the kind of thing that zero trust networking is supposed to mitigate. The problem is, if you go to the vendor for your firewall for your zero trust networking, are you still safe? If you go to the vendor for the firewall for doing your intrusion monitoring inside the systems, doing your deep packet analysis, are you still safe? This is a great place for having vendor diversity.
100%. I think that's a great point, Lou. Thank you. Now, with that, that's going to cover this week's episode. We couldn't do this podcast without listeners like you, so we'd love to hear what you think. Do you have a topic that you want us to take on? Do you have feedback on the topics that we discussed today? Send an email to feedback@itsparkcast.com. That's itsparkcast.com, or hit us up on X at IT SPARC Cast. Be sure to like, subscribe, turn on notifications. It's really going to help this channel grow so we can keep bringing you great content like we hope we're doing now. We'll be back next week with more news and opinions from the world of enterprise IT. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for dropping by. Let's do it again next week.